It is my pleasure this morning to introduce the keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker for today, Prof. Peter Clayton. Prof. Clayton is an emeritus professor of Rhodes University and was, until recently, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research and Innovation. He was in this role from 2008 to 2022. Prior to being appointed as a DVC, he was a professor of computer science at Rhodes University. Prof. Clayton has served as at a number of international bodies related to research and scholarly production. Relevant to today's talk are the Board of the National Research Foundation, Chair of the Board of Africa Journals Online, and Chair of the Department of Higher Education and Training Research Outputs Evaluation Panel. So it is my pleasure to welcome you for your time.
Good morning, everybody, and I really value this opportunity of sharing some ideas with you this morning. And I'll see my slides are up, so I can go. What I hope to be able to do is respond to that question that Professor Mapula just asked of us. How can CE become truly an integral part of the university? And I'm going to talk about scholarship. So that being just one of the ways that I believe that community engagement can take its rightful place on an equal footing with the more historic pillars of public universities. So we like to talk about public universities as being in the public good, of course, and most public universities cite their community engagement programs as one of the prime examples of their public good. Of course, there are others as well. But we like to roll that out. We like to, certainly at Rhodes University, we very much like to point to roost when we are asked the question, what public good does this university serve? And so the question I want to share some ideas with you this morning about is what it means for scholarship for a university to be in the public good. And I'm going to deliberately focus on one aspect of engaged research, and that's CBPR, community-based participatory research. And the reason for that is that, in my experience, that is the area of engaged research that is the biggest mismatch with the kind of historic research governance tools that we've got. And so it produces the greatest areas of discomfort when we're trying to achieve good results in it. So, and that doesn't mean that the others aren't important, of course, but that's the reason why I'm picking on that particular aspect of engaged research. There's another reason, of course, is that if we are looking at being a university in the public good, then I believe that we have to move beyond in community engagement, in our research and community engagement. We have to move beyond the point where we are satisfied with mutually beneficial work. Mutually beneficial work, of course, is something that we talk about a huge amount in community engagement. But I think we can go beyond that in the scholarship space and in other spaces as well. But the one way we can go beyond that is looking at co-created knowledge. And co-created knowledge is a level way beyond mutually beneficial, I believe, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. So, let's start by talking a little bit. I'll learn to use this in a moment, hang on. There we go. Let me start by talking a little bit initially about the primary purpose at the most fundamental level of public universities. And I know we can argue about this. Universities do all kinds of things. But the very core purpose of a university is all around knowledge. That's what distinguishes universities from most other research institutes, social welfare institutions, public service institutions, and civil society type institutions, NGOs, and so on. So public universities really exist around knowledge. The role of public universities is to, first of all, disseminate knowledge. That's why people get degrees, they go and study, apply knowledge, and the part I really want to talk about, applying knowledge, of course, encompasses community engagement and other forms of applying knowledge. But the part I really want to talk about today is creating new knowledge, the scholarship side of the university. And that's one of the things that universities are mandated to do, to create new knowledge for the benefit of society and, of course, the natural world as well. So, the structures that we have to evaluate and govern research have been established over many, many years, many decades, in fact. Rhodes University happens to be almost 120 years old. We'll celebrate 120 years next year. This year, as I'm sure those of you who were here yesterday heard, our Community Engagement Division, RUS, is celebrating its 15th year. Now, we're very proud of 15 years, of course, but 15 as a proportion of 120, quite small still. So when we talk about the three pillars of the university being teaching and learning, research and community engagement, teaching and learning, here anyway is 120 years old, RUS 15 years old, still kind of a little sister. And so it's not surprising that community engagement in, it's not just this university, I think all universities that I'm familiar with, is fighting for its rightful place as an integral part of the university, and that a lot of the governance structures and the funding structures, particularly of the university, were developed over decades before community engagement was being taken terribly seriously. And so we find them fitting the model of engaged research quite uncomfortably at times. Okay, so what are some of the challenges that we face? And I'm going to talk about three particularly today, because a lot of the time we do community engagement type research, and it fits quite comfortably. But there are some aspects, and particularly, as I indicated at the beginning when we're talking about community-based participation in research, where that fit is quite uncomfortable. So I've chosen three areas which I think are the three most uncomfortable areas that we need to work on to make sure that CBPR is an integral part of the kind of research that we're able to do in universities. And the first one is ethical research processes. I'll come back to these. I'll just name the three of them so that you can mull them over while I get to them. The timelines with the undertaking reasonable causal research, and I'll explain it a little bit more. And then making sure that we produce outputs that count. A lot of our engaged research produces amazing outputs, and it's not counted in the formal sense. And I'll come back to that as well. So let's talk about ethical research for starters, or ethical processes. And I've written down some of the primary laws that govern ethics around research in our institution. And they're quite weighty things to engage with. And of course, we want to comply with ethical criteria. A lot of the ethical frameworks that we are using in our sector at the moment are relatively new. And it doesn't mean that we were unethical before these came into place, but compliance and the weight of compliance is increasing all of the time. The fact that it's not good enough to have good processes, we've got to be able to show that what we do complies to quality frameworks these days. And so ethical approval is one of those. And of course, we want to be able to do that. And so in terms of community engagements, these are the primary ethical approval process, laws, ethical that govern ethics when we are undertaking engaged research. And the particular aspect that I want to point to that has caused us a lot of problems is this one cap. One of the primary tenets of ethical approval is that you need to get ethical approval prior to undertaking the research at the beginning. And of course, if you are doing community-based participatory research, where you're using your community partners to help you literally design the research, there's a huge culture clash in being required to do this. And so we've seen many people bang their heads against it, and much gnashing of teeth and tears and so on. Ethical approval really is about managing risk, and we all, I mean, I've not come across a researcher that doesn't agree that we need to be ethical in our research approaches. We need to manage risk, we need to mitigate risks, things can go wrong. But requiring that to be done ahead of time results in the researcher having to have all the ducks in place before they start, before they engage with the community partner. And of course, that just cuts out the agency of the community partner. So that's one of the very big areas that we need. I don't think the legislation quite gets in the way of that, but processes that have been established in institutions have kind of predate the importance of being able to do participatory research with communities. Of course, we understand why that is. And one of the things, let me just go back to that previous slide. One of the things, if you haven't yet had to fill in an ethical approval process, you might not have come across this. One of the things that makes ethical approval for almost every kind of community engagement program more difficult than what it was designed for is that it all falls under the National Health Act. So ethics in this country has really grown up in the medical community. And so it's designed to protect people undergoing drug trials, undergoing experimental surgeries, undergoing things like in the animal space, vivisection, and so on. I'll just wait for that to come up. And so we're load shedding, I believe. However, we're in this beautiful place with a generator. And so it's no surprise, really, that in that space, where the kind of relationship between the participant and the researcher is a very uneven relationship, education-wise, knowledge-wise, and culture-wise, it's really not a surprise that all these restrictions are in place to make sure that essentially we're not exploiting the participants. And that's the kind of history that we've walked when it comes to ethical approval. And so what we really have to make sure that we do in our university systems and our other research institute systems where we are doing engaged research is that we have ethical approval processes that allow us to get started. Of course, you need some sort of ethical approval before every process. You won't get money unless you've got ethical approval. You won't be able to publish those results unless you've got ethical approval. Most journals now require to see your ethical approval statement and so on. So you need a process that allows you to get started and then cycle back once you've designed it a little bit more. And that really requires some knowledge of the community-based approach in ethics committees, and that's not always there. And so the particular problem that we've experienced in some of our faculty ethical approval process at our university is that people sitting on the approval process throw back the application saying, this is too vague. You haven't got, what are you going to do? And you go back and say, well, I don't know yet because I haven't talked to my partner, and then we'll decide what to do. That's not good enough. You've got to have a process that takes uncertainty into account and at the same time mitigates against risk. So that's quite a tricky space to negotiate. So that's one of the big challenges that I think we face when it comes to CBPR. And of course, the solution there, I'm going to say this and you're going to hate it, the solution there is for the CBPR practitioners to be on those committees. There is no other solution. And every time I say that to research, they say, geez, you know, I'm so busy already and you want me to go and sit on these committees as well. It's not going to change in a meaningful way, I don't think, if the only people sitting on those committees are the lab-based and the office-bound researchers. You have the community engagement practitioners on those committees helping to establish the process and so on. So unfortunately, it means more work for you, but I don't think there's any other way. The second problem that I highlighted there, let's go forward again, was the kind of timelines that we are restricted to in a lot of our research. This is not just about engaged research. Some of the most useful forms of engaged research look at collaborations over a long period of time to understand change, continuity, and most importantly, causality. And I'll come back to this point in a moment as well, because I want to just talk a little bit about causality. But long-term projects are particularly meaningful in the community engagement space. And our structures, for the most part, are not designed for long-term projects. Occasionally, you'll get an external funding partner that commits for 5 years or 10 years even. But if you have a really serious social problem, you really need longer, you really need the long-term kinds of horizon. Of course, the kind of research labor that we have in universities anyway are students. And students come and they move on. It's very hard to undertake longitudinal research with honor students, for example. They need to come in, they need to get their project going. By the end of that year, they need to hand it in. It's got to be done and dusted. Master students not as difficult. PhD students a bit easier because they are more in-depth studies and longer studies. And the other problem that is often pointed to in universities, it's not as big a problem in South Africa as in other countries, is hiring academic staff and researchers on short-term contracts. That also is a very, very difficult thing to do in terms of getting longitudinal projects going. And then, of course, the others that I've written down there, the rapid assessment techniques, the consultancy snapshot reviews, and the research funding cycles themselves. I'm sure that in most of your universities, your research committee has some sort of funding cycle. Most internal funding cycles are annual. So you'll get some money, and you've got to say what you did at the end of the year to get some money for the next year. And if you say, well, I'm setting up my 15-year longitudinal study, it might work in the first year, but by the end of year 2, people are going to say, seriously, how many papers did you write? Yeah? So it's really quite difficult to do that. So, timelines for undertaking community-based research. Some of the most valuable knowledge coming out of engaged research is causal in nature. And what do I mean by causal? This is a term that's suddenly become quite popular, I think. Causal really as looking for the root causes of a problem and not perhaps in the research undertaking an intervention, but making it possible for interventions to be designed. So trying to lead a changed social or environmental condition, as opposed to observational research. And a lot of community-based research, of course, is observational. Why? Because of exactly all those problems I listed on the previous slide. Is you've got a very short-term cycle, your students got to have a thesis by the end of it, your funding only lasts for that year, and so on and so on and so on. And so what can you do? Well, you can go and study the problem and try and make it better understood. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. We know that famous saying that's been attributed to so many people. I don't actually know who originally said it. But it goes along the lines of, you know, if I had to solve a problem that my life depended on, you know, and I only had an hour to do it, I'd take the first 50 minutes establishing what the right question is. I think it was meant to be Einstein asked that question, but I think I've heard it from so many, attributed to so many people, I really don't know who did. So there's nothing wrong with finding out what the right question to ask is to get an answer. But that kind of approach doesn't always help us get into an intervention. The example I wanted to give you in that last line there is an example from, not from this university, it's the example of the National Income Dynamics Study, which is headed by UCT, headed by a professor called Murray Leibrand, who's really well known for poverty studies. And he has, he started off at Rhodes University, which is why we are familiar with this work, and he still collaborates with a number of our researchers here. And this work started in 2007. Well, in fact, it was formalized in 2007. He started it earlier than that. And so it took about 10 years before he had the right kind of longitudinal data to really make an effect. And he has been very, very influential in the National Planning Commission, and particularly in the deployment of social grants in this country. The kind of way social grants were not necessarily deployed, I think it's the wrong word. There was, I think, a lot of criticism around the way they were deployed, but the way they were framed for the COVID era relied very heavily on this kind of work. But he could not have come up with this kind of reliable causal information in a year. It required quite a long period of study involving many communities, many contexts, and 15 or so, 16 or so years later, proves to be unbelievably valuable information, a valuable data set in steering our strategy around tackling one of our most serious problems. So causal research is one of the areas that's most valuable to us, I think, and it's one of the areas where we get some of the biggest challenges when it comes to the clash that we have with the kind of governance structures and the funding structures that we have for research. Causal research is research aimed at solutions. It needs contextual knowledge. It consequently requires community-based participation from the design outset. And it makes community members an essential component of the generation of new knowledge. So I think this is really where we fully move beyond mutually beneficial, and we can start talking about co-creation. And it's absolutely right when we get to co-creation that those community partners are co-owners of the concepts, co-authors of the papers, collaborators in every sense in the scholarly way. Not just participants, collaborators, scholarly collaborators. And so I think it's something to really aim for two reasons. One is, of course, it addresses real problems. It aims at giving us real solutions to real deep issues in society, and let's not always forget in the environment as well. We've got a lot of environmental issues that need the same kind of approach. And secondly, of course, I think this, more than anything else we do in the community engagement space, is where we will take community engagement to be on an equal footing in every respect with other parts of the other pillars of the university, where community engagement is the scholarship in its own right, and community engagement partners are the joint authors of the results that we produce. Keep an eye on the time. Okay, the third area that I pointed to that was quite a challenge was producing outputs that count as a real scholarly knowledge. And here too we encountered some challenges, although I think we're fairly well on our way to solving some of these. In the space, peer review is everything. That's the way our tradition has built up. That's the approach that says a bureaucrat doesn't decide whether some research is good or bad. A peer who understands that research decides. So we do not get a social scientist to peer review a physics output. We get a top physicist to do it, and vice versa. Peer review. And all of our structure and our quality assurance rests on that foundation of peer review. External examining, peer review. Papers that we send out for conferences, for journals, peer review, and so on. And even accreditation of universities. Do we get the DATT in or something? No, we don't. We get peers from other universities and accredit us to the Council for Higher Education and so on. Peer review. And peer review in the scholarly space rests on these other three bullet points I've got below peer review. Peer review in the scholarly space says, is this original? Now, this is a relatively new idea. When I say relatively new, I'm talking about the last 50 years or so. In the 1400s and so on, when universities were first kind of forming, originality wasn't a big thing. You know, if you found somebody talking about a good idea, you started talking about it, and everyone was happy about that because it was a good idea. And you didn't necessarily have to say, well, actually, I got that from Shakespeare or whoever said it first. Now, of course, it's a very big sin if you don't cite your source. So originality has become a really big hallmark of scholarship. And we have to take this on board in the community engagement space too. Is the work that we're doing original? Can we report on it as original? Is it archivable? Can we store it away somehow for future generations to benefit from? Can we store it away somewhere, somehow, so that places other than our immediate locality where we're working, our research domain, our immediate research scope, can benefit from the outcomes? And if we get those two bullet points right, of course, it's always citable. Citable means, can I refer to it? Can I cite it? And of course, in the textual writing domain, citations are really easy to do. When you quote somebody's idea, their concept, or their actual text, you cite them and say, I got this from that paper, or I got this from so-and-so who spoke at that conference, and you give them a reference. And you cite them. So we've got to really think about how to do these things in a completely different space, because we've grown up in scholarship in the text space. We've grown up saying, I write a piece of writing, at the end I have all my references. What are they? Other pieces of writing. So it's writing, because that's what we know how to do. And people can follow those links, of course, and they can check out our citations, our references, they can go and look them up. And so somebody picking up our work can fully follow through our thought processes, what the building blocks are that we're arguing on top of, and so on. Now that doesn't translate always into spaces where a paper is not the only output. An improved social condition might be the output. An improved environmental condition might be the output. Some sort of impact, like transfer of skills, might be the output. And the idea is, how do we take those kind of outputs of engaged research, show that they are original? I didn't just do the same thing that so-and-so did. Show that they are archivable. How do we archive them? And of course, if they're original and archivable, if they're archivable anyway, we can cite them. Other people can cite them. And that's one of the measures that become very, very important in the textual space. Citations. So if you want to go for a NRF rating, or you are going for a grant that you want for your research, one of the ways that you impress your peer reviewers is you tell them how many times you've been cited, how many times you've been influential in your writing, basically. I've written a paper, and other people are putting my paper in their reference list. They're talking about, they're building on my ideas. I have been intellectually influential. I've been cited. And of course, citation indices and bibliometrics, big business in the journal space. How do we translate that into outputs that are not about textual references, that are about other kinds of impact. And I think we have to, I don't have the answers for that, all the answers for that. But again, I'm going to irritate you and say the way to get that right is for the spaces that make the rules about that to have engaged researchers on them, and for not only to be the lab-based researchers that make those rules. And so engaged research is sometimes hard, and I came across a paper a while ago that he said exactly that. Despite the fact that, here's a paper down here, Feeney and Pollickett in, where was it now, in the Journal of Sociology and Health and Illness. And that's basically, their whole paper was basically a long whinge saying the stuff is impossible to do because everything we do, the governance structures of our universities, the funding structures, everything is against us, despite the fact that there are strong statements from institutions that commit themselves to engage research. Funding patterns, bureaucratic structures, and the over-reliance on short-term participants make it difficult and sometimes impossible. It's hard. So there are a couple of challenges that still need resolution, and three of the main ones, and I've covered some of this already, so I won't repeat myself. I'll talk about three of the main ones. One is the ethical approval one. I told you about the challenge that we have here. I think that's actually quite easy to fix. What you need is ethical approval processes that are not heavyweight and allow some sort of cyclical approach so that you can get away with a draft idea with around saying who the partner is, and a way of coming back without too much repetition and bureaucratic overhead to say, okay, now we've worked it out, give it a stamp of approval. The next one is the meaning of peer review in community-based participatory research. And what I'm aiming at here is, if we're going to push towards meaningful co-creation with our partners in the community, surely the next step is that when we go for peer review, they have got to be treated as peers, right? Doesn't that follow logically? And of course, that is fraught. That is fraught because why? Often we get into spaces with communities with a very big differential in education levels. We get into spaces where there's a very big differential in experience in formal research processes and so on. And so you've got to get the systems, not necessarily those, usually the researchers are convinced of this, you've got to get the systems that approve and govern the research in your institutions, like ethics, for example, and others. And of course, you've got to get funders to get comfortable with that. And as far as I can see so far, most universities who've got substantial engaged research programs are getting comfortable with it. But I've yet to see a statutory funder who will send a proposal out to a community partner unless that community partner has got all the same credentials as the person applying from the university. So I think that's a very big hurdle that we have to get some sort of parameters around. I don't think we have to change the conditions, but we have to change the parameters around which people can get comfortable with. Quite a big challenge, that one, I think. And the third one is accreditation for different kinds of research methodologies, engaged methodologies. And again, I think this is quite a big one, and it's going to require the involvement of practitioners in the right kinds of committees and in the right kinds of spaces where these things are wrestled with. So the history we walked in South Africa has been one in which funding of universities has changed quite substantially in the 2000s. We had a very big change of funding formula in 2004, and this is the first point at which research in university was actually funded from a statutory source. And the way they decided to fund it has been unbelievably effective. They decided that the right way to do it would be to put a financial reward onto certain kinds of research outputs. And the ones that are counted are graduations by thesis, so master's and PhD level, and then of course publications, journal publications, conference publications if they're accredited, and scholarly books. And what that has done is it's seen the output of research from South African institutions soar, just go up hugely. The graph is unbelievably steep. We saw quite a marked flattening off over the COVID years, but it's on its way up again. And of course, the criticism there always is, everybody's just publishing rubbish now, publish or perish, the quality is going down. But the real data is showing that that's not true. What we've seen is that the problems of research misconduct are going up. It's absolutely undeniable. And of course, the IT bots and so on that are fashionable to talk about now are not going to help with that. So we are seeing increased cases in universities of research misconduct, plagiarism, and so on. Self-plagiarism, big problems. However, we've seen the citation of journal papers in South Africa go up in proportion to the number of papers going out, which means that as the number has gone up, our influence has gone up in the world space in terms of knowledge production. You cannot argue with that data. It's a fantastic success story, despite all the problems that we've gathered along the way. So that's been a huge success story for scholarship in this country. If your kind of scholarship lends itself towards writing papers, you absolutely made it. It's working really well. Of course, not everybody's scholarship lends itself towards that. And I mean, the way people have been making do so far is to kind of straddle, different kinds of research so that they do write about their research as well as produce other kinds of outputs. And the success story there in recent years has been creative outputs. So some of you might be involved in the creative output space, drama, music, and so on, fine arts, also other kinds of creative outputs, filmmaking, I think algorithms, computer algorithms, and what's the other one? Patents, I think, patents. So for the last 4 years, in fact, we've been able to put forward creative outputs for accreditation and for funding. And so exhibition will earn you the same sort of kudos as a book, if it's a substantial exhibition. And a work of drama will, and a musical score, even a script for a creative output can earn you an accredited output now. But that took at least 15 years of discussion around how it would work to come into being, and it's still kind of its birth pangs. Most universities aren't producing many of these outputs, because we're lacking to kind of get our heads around how to measure the quality. And the quality has got to be kind of equivalent to what we see in journals. So what is the peer review of a musical concert? How do we get those peer reviews in? What makes it original and scholarly? How is it pushing the boundaries of knowledge as opposed to somebody just up and be playing the piece that we've heard thousands of people play before? So pushing the boundaries of original scholarly knowledge are still in those metrics, and peer review is still in those metrics. However, that process is up and going. And I think the next big challenge for us is, how do we do this in the engaged research space? How do we accredit engaged research as a project, keeping the archival nature of it? So we know how to do that now in the creative space. We have to take videos and so on of a play and archive it so it can be referenced by others. We have to have peer reviews of the play and so on. How do we do that in the engaged research space? Get the archiving right, get the peer review right, and to get the definition of what represents original scholarly knowledge in the engaged work that we are doing with community partners. What makes it original as opposed to something that somebody else tried, somebody else, and we're trying it here. How can people elsewhere learn from this and build on what we're doing because we've had some new ideas? So getting accreditation for engaged research methodologies, I think, is a very big challenge for us as a sector. And if we can get that right over the next couple of years, it'll be a huge leap forward for engaged research, which I think will bode well in every single way for us as a nation. One of the things that have stuck in my mind when we were arguing around creative outputs and accrediting them was a talk that was given by one of our colleagues here at Rhodes, who's now a retired professor of drama, Andrew Buckland. He's also a really famous performer. Some of you might have seen his performances. And he was speaking about how you could recognize originality in performances, drama performances. But he opened my eyes by inventing this term, the tyranny of text, that we were thinking as university managers only in form of text, because people were saying things like, well, write about your play, or write about your piece of music, and then it'll fit the rules. And so he coined this phrase, the tyranny of text. There are other ways of being creative other than text. There are other ways of archiving knowledge other than text. And I kind of like that. And so what I want to challenge all of you about, and myself, and all of those who are wrestling with this, is what are the tyrannies? What's happening? What are the tyrannies? Oh, no, I'm going too far. That we have to break through to recognize new knowledge and new scholarly concepts in the engaged research domain. I don't even know what all those tyrannies are. And those of you working in it every day will be able to cite them all, at least some of them, I'm sure. Probably we can't see them all because the lens we hold up to the research that we do is limited. It's designed around other kinds of research, historical kinds of ways of governing and measuring research. So there have got to be tyrannies that we've got to label and say, this is inappropriate for the kind of work that is really valuable for these reasons, and persuade others of them, of course, which is often the hard part. Okay, my time's up, but I'm nearly done. I wanted to add two more things at the end that I think are really important. And just because every time I get a chance to talk, I say these things. And so some of you will have heard them before, and I apologize, but if you haven't, it's important. So some big shifts in scholarly publishing are happening at the moment. And the very big one is the shift around open access publishing. And you all will have come across that, where we're trying to move away from this absolute hegemony of big publishers that are holding the whole scholarship across the planet to ransom. And it's our own fault. We created this over many decades. Academics said, we're the people writing, we're happy to be the referees and so on, but we're not going to do all this admin work. Let's give it to the publishing houses. And the publishing houses said, bring it on. And now we have publishing houses like the one up here, Elsevier. Elsevier is always the one that everyone loves to hate. Why? Because they make so much money, and all of their money comes out of the academic sector. The CEO of Elsevier is on the Forbes top 100 earners in Europe every single year. And somehow that's just wrong. That's just wrong. And in fact, some of the other, if you get hold of these slides and click on them, I'll put click-throughs to these articles. This article over here about Elsevier claims that Elsevier, over the last couple of years, had higher profit margins than Google and Microsoft. Now, that doesn't mean they made more money than Google and Microsoft, I think, but that means that the capital asset ratio, the money they make out of what they do, is a much higher margin. And so, yeah, I mean, it's very hard as an academic not to find that wrong, I don't think I need to persuade you of that. However, there's been some very big shifts. So that first article, both these articles, look at the dates of them on the last few days, by the way. So this is happening right now. So if you click through to that article, you'll read about the EU has been taking a stand against big publishers for a long time in the government level funding of institutions. And so a number of countries, and the particular hero here is Sweden. And Sweden has led this effort and has persuaded the rest of the EU to go with it. So this is actually saying that the EU is ready to back immediate open access without author fees, because open access goes along with page charges, not so. And they're not quite saying that you can't have page charges, but they're saying page charges must be reasonable and they must be transparent. You must know where that money is going. And so they are requiring publishers, this hasn't gone through as a bill yet in the EU. It is a technical paper, but has been accepted by every single country in their technical working committee. And it's going to be put before the EU Parliament, I think, on some date in this, towards the end of May. So this is kind of happening now, and they are doing the world a massive favor doing this. This one over here, Elsevier, there have been lots of stories like this. This is not the first one. This is a story about a particular high impact factor journal run by Elsevier, where the entire scholarly team, I'm battling for words. What do you call them? The refereeing team. Yeah. Help me? Editorial team. Thank you. I knew that a name. Has resigned, and they resigned because they put forward a motion to Elsevier to make the charges, the page charges, reasonable, and Elsevier declined, and so they just resigned in mass. And so I think there's also a very, and these are some formidable people on the journal doing that. Okay, the last thing, and then I'll sit down, that I want to just leave you with is a little bit of a challenge, but an easy one. And I've said this many times, and apologies to those of you who've heard it. But this is a real example of being the change that you want to see. And the example I like giving is the H-index, which most people in this kind of space hate. Now, the H-index was invented by Hirsch, who's a physicist, and it's a way of kind of smoothing out lucky chances where one of your papers gets cited a lot. And it basically says your H number is how many times your papers have been cited. So you've got an H index of 10, then at least 10 of your papers have been cited 10 times. If it's 1, then one of your papers has been cited 1 time. And it kind of smooths out the effect where you luck out because you said something really popular and one of your papers was cited 10,000 times and all the rest of your papers were ignored. So in fact, you have a very limited overall intellectual influence. Anyway, that works really well and is really popular in the physical sciences. Natural sciences, sort of a little bit popular. By the time you go to the social sciences, really not popular at all. And by the time you go into the creative arts and so on, literally hated. So it's something that funders have picked up quite a lot. I think people have got a bit more sensitive to the fact that it doesn't go across all disciplines now. But a lot of the funders, the NRF being one of them, ask for your H index if you're going for something like a rating review, or if you're going for most of their funded programs. What's your H index? Now, the point I want to make is the funders didn't invent the H index. The researchers did. Why do the funders use it? Well, because it's easy and it's convenient, and the researchers were telling them that. So what I want to challenge you to do is to find those metrics that work for you and to parrot them out every time you write a proposal to your university, to the NRF, to any other funder, because if the sector that works with engaged research finds particular metrics for impact useful, the funders will pick them up. And so that's the way I think that we can, as individuals, start to sway the way that we are scored. And with that, I really thank you for your attention and this opportunity. And sure, it's time. Okay.
Thank you, Prof, for that insightful presentation. And also thank you for challenging all the community-based participatory research practitioners to be a part of the university ethics committees so that we promote CBPR as a way of engaging also with our community partners in a meaningful way, create knowledge. So I'm just going to allow us to ask the Prof only 2 questions because of time. He's going to respond to 2 questions. We have 2 questions from the floor. Yes, Prof.
Mine is not a question, so I don't know whether it qualifies to that.
Feedback.
Everybody's given the opportunity. I like Prof for saying it for thank you for that and for bringing it out very clearly. When I picked in the house by the end, we had the same engagement. I said, community engaged practitioners and scholars must move away from the criteria that are now being used, especially to achieve university rankings, citation counts, the H index, and what makes a scholarly research. You have studied it very clearly. But you have left us with a big question, which I think we need to engage in over a long period of time. How do we then get our validation? Even yesterday, I was talking about the hostile ethical clearance protocols that has not recognized community-based participatory research. I put it hostile because I struggle with mine, and sometimes I've got to use my 30 SDC to bully them to accept community-based participatory research. But that is not correct. The practitioner should be accepted on their own right, not because of VC has said how to do it. Which is what we need to do. So I thank you so much for the presentation.
One more question.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. I didn't do my vocal warm-ups today. I thought that'd be quiet. Prof, I'm going to start with a disclaimer that I don't even think this is an appropriate question for you, but it was prompted by the presentation. You were talking about the necessity of CBPR practitioners and researchers forming part of those ethical standards committees and really sort of, as we say in activist spaces, disrupting those spaces so that we can reshape the protocol. And you mentioned that one of the tricky tensions is that of balancing this with practical deliverable timelines and the timelines of funders. And I'm asking this question particularly from, I guess, an organizing perspective, but I think it's quite relevant here. How do we start to pull in the funders into this type of conversation? Because at some point you need to also find ways of developing a relationship with donors and supporters that understands the intricacies and the requisite agility needed to run work of this nature.
Okay, good question. Can I just respond to the first feedback? It's called not a question. First of all, you're absolutely right, and thank you for that. And researchers do experience the ethical process approval as hostile because they get thrown back at them. There's not enough here. So I think you're absolutely right. I would think it was quite dangerous for the VC to be able to overrule an ethics committee, though. I think what you I think that sets sets in place a kind of managerialism that you don't want in a university. What the VC is really meant to do, I think, is to say, this is not working for all parts of the university. Take it to the faculties in the Senate and argue it out and give me a solution to that. But to overrule is quite a dangerous way of doing it, I think. That's my view. In terms of how do you talk to the funders, I think that's kind of in place for statutory funders. You know, when you're talking to private industry and some of the foundations that are run by, individuals, I think it's a different matter. But a lot of the time, private industry and individuals can make a lot quicker, individual foundations can make a lot quicker decisions than statutory funders. In statutory funders, the people making those kind of value judgments are already our colleagues. let's use the NRF because that's our biggest funder in South Africa for research. All of the committees that decide on grants are volunteer academics from the various universities. The NRF itself sets up the program, manages the programs, does all the bureaucracy. The people who make the decision around your particular proposal is never a manager at the NRF. It's always our colleagues in academia. So I think we've got the right people there. Or maybe we haven't got the right people there. We've got the right class of people there. Let's make sure we've got the right spread of people there. Is probably the challenge. Yeah.
Sorry, due to time constraints, we're not going to take any more questions. Thank you so much, Prof.
Okay, thank you.